All right, so I know I touched on simulating cloth a little bit last week, which incidentally I didn't record that video yet. Um, but now we're going to talk about cloth simulation for particularly useful things like making shirts feel a little bit more natural on a character. So with cloth simulation, there's kind of two main components to it. And that's going to be whatever you're actually going to simulate as cloth, and then oftentimes you're going to have something that's going to collide with to get the form. So on a very super basic level, you can have let's say you have a sphere and then a plane. Okay, and I'll move the plane up here. And this sphere will be our collision object. So if I go to the physics tab, which is this kind of bouncing ball icon, and click collision, this is now a collision object. That means that when I simulate the physics, this will be considered something that is collidable. Okay, and then this will be my fabric. So I will click cloth. Now in the cloth options, there are many of them. The first and perhaps most obvious one is this cloth presets drop down, and you can choose from 5 different presets for different types of cloth that will behave differently. So we'll stick with cotton for now. And then to actually simulate, there are 2 things that you can do. You can hit Alt-A, which does that, and it acted really funny, and I'll tell you why in a moment. Or you can click Bake, and Bake will count. You'll see that little white box. It'll count up to 100. That's a percentage of rendering out all of the different frames, which you determine right here. And then you can play it back without it having to calculate. Oh, I know, that's acting really funny. If you don't like that bake and you want to try it again and change some settings, then you just click Free Bake, and then you can change your settings again. So, why did this cloth act really funny? Well, that's because it's just one face. There's not enough detail, there's not enough resolution in this mesh to actually render out anything even remotely believable. So if I go into edit mode on the plane and hit W and subdivide, and then hit F6, I can change the number of cuts to 10. Tab back into object mode, and let's rebake it. Okay, you can see it now counting up to 100. Okay. Now if I hit Alt-A, there's a cloth sim. Now it's going to bounce around and kind of dance for a while until it runs out or it falls off the ball. Okay, so I would probably even want to subdivide this once more. Okay, and then go back to frame 1. We'll free that bake. And this time I just hit Alt-A. That is actually really cool. I accidentally did that. And that's because I subdivided it without freeing all the bakes. No? Oh, hold on a second. What happened? Alright, so I just had to rebake it. Now it's behaving a little bit more like cloth, and then it's going to slide off the ball and then fall into the abyss until the timeline runs out. Alright, so on its very simplest level, that is cloth simulation. So how do we apply this then to our actual characters? Well, guess what? I'm going to show you. Alright, so on layer 1 here, I've got my torso object, my torso, and then this hooded vest thing. And so I want to do the same thing. I should note also that for a collision object, you can usually get away with something that is much lower resolution. So I could take my base mesh here and use this as the collision object. I believe they do have to be on the same layer. But I'm not going to do that in this instance, simply because I've made enough changes to the proportions of my torso that my base mesh is no longer perfectly accurate. And instead of taking the time to adjust my base mesh, I'm on a fast enough computer that I don't really need to do that, and I can just use my higher resolution torso mesh as the collision. Okay, so to actually simulate this, the first thing I'm going to do is, because I don't have a backup in this file, I'm going to duplicate my vest, and I'm going to move it to the last layer just so I have that duplicate. And I will rename that duplicate as well. Okay. Oops. Cool. Now I can forget about that. So, much like the ball and the plane, the torso is going to get the collision, and then the vest is going to get the cloth. And if I just go with the defaults and hit Alt-A, it's going to think for a bit, and it's going to start simulating, and it's going to simulate kind of slow. But you can see that it is actually behaving like cloth. All right, so we're at frame 67. That's enough to see what's going to happen. I'll go back to frame 1 and hit Alt-A. And it's actually still not playing back super smooth. It's probably because I am recording things. But it's not quite behaving the way that cloth should. And one of the perhaps most noticeable things is that the cloth is not really colliding with the mesh so much as hovering above it. And so we also have some intersections here that we don't want. So there's a couple of issues that we need to address. The first thing is going to be the distance of the collision. And so as we look through, well, let me go over the general settings first. So we have the cloth pane, that we have got our presets. We've got quality, which is pretty obvious. The higher the number, the more realistic the simulation is. This will also affect how long it takes to calculate the render, so try to get by with as low a number as you can. You've got material properties, so the mass, you can make the fabric heavier or lighter, so silk will have a smaller value than leather. Structural, and if you hover over these you can see the tooltip. Overall stiffness of the structure. Bending is the wrinkle coefficient, so a bigger number gives you larger wrinkles, a smaller number gives you smaller wrinkles. You've got damping values, so springiness, higher is smoother but less jiggling. Air resistance and velocity dampening. We have a pinning option, which you can tell certain vertices based on a vertex group not to move, not to be affected by the cloth simulation, or to be affected a reduced amount. Then you have a pre-roll value. So if this is going to be if you're going to actually use this as animation, for this purpose here, we're not going to use the cloth simulation as an animation. We're actually going to bake out the simulation. So we're going to simulate it, find a frame that we like, and then we're going to apply that to the cloth object, and that's going to be its position for all of the frames. But if you're actually going to be seeing the animation, you can pre-roll a certain number of frames, because you'll notice as you play it, it takes a little bit to start actually looking like cloth, even though this is, not a great simulation right now. But it takes a few frames for it to actually start looking and behaving like cloth. So you can pre-roll those frames so that the non-cloth looking frames happen before, before 0 on the timeline. So by the time you actually start seeing the cloth simulation, it's already looking and behaving like cloth. Cloth cache, so you can save the simulation data to the hard disk. Cloth collision, so if it's going to be colliding with things and not just blowing in the wind on its own, you need to have cloth collision enabled. If it's not going to be colliding with anything, turn this off and it will drastically speed up the renders. So, right now, if I turn it off, you can see how much faster that figures out the frames than if I turn that back on, and it's, obviously choking a lot more. All right. So that's cloth collision. You can enable self-collision, so the cloth can collide with itself, which for some things is necessary, but again, that'll just slow down the renders. And then you've got some more advanced options down here. You can change how much the cloth is affected by gravity versus wind versus drag and all sorts of different things down here, but we won't really be dealing with that at all. Okay, so that's an overview of the settings. Now, if we look back at our simulation, there's a couple things happening. One of the first ones is, right now, it's actually getting really weird. And that's because parts of the mesh are actually getting stuck inside of the collision object, and it doesn't know how to reconcile that, because something gets stuck inside the collision object, and then it can't get back outside of it because it's colliding with it. So, what I'm going to do is go back to frame 1, tab into edit mode, select my mesh, my vest, and I'm going to hit Alt-S and scale it out along the normals. And I'm just going to increase the space around my collision object, because I want to make sure that it's not the entire vest is starting above my collision object. Okay, so I'll just scale that up a little bit, and then let's resimulate that, and you can see that now it is behaving a little bit better. Okay, cool. So that's the first thing. The next thing that we noticed is that the collision distance is pretty wide, so that if we scroll down here to cloth collision, that's this distance value, and it's already pretty small, but it actually we need to make it even smaller. So I'm going to go with 0.002, and now it's giving us a little bit more of a believable distance there. Okay. It could probably still go even lower, so we'll go 0.001, and we'll leave it at that. Okay. From a distance, we should be good there. Also, right now this cloth doesn't have any depth, any thickness. After the fact, we can always go back and add a solidify modifier and just increase the thickness too, and that will help kind of hide that. And already, you know, that already looks actually pretty good, and you know, there are certainly instances where this is even good enough for to be passable. But we're not going to worry about the solidify modifier right now. All right, I'm going to go back to my physics settings. The next thing that I want to adjust is the overall stiffness. I think I want to bring that down just a little bit. I'm going to go, I think I'll go with like 10 maybe. I'm also going to up the springiness, because you'll notice if I play that back, the bottom of the hem is going to be bouncing around a lot, and I don't want that in my render, so I'm going to bump up the springiness quite a bit. I think we'll try like 40. And then we have a friction value, which is the friction of the cloth and anything it kind of runs up against. So I want to make sure the hood isn't going to slide off the head, so I'm going to bump up the friction to, I don't know, we'll try 10 and see how that goes. And I think I'm ready to take another pass at the simulation and see what that looks like. So I'm just going to free all bakes, and then I will hit bake and pause the render. While this finishes up its calculations, I do want to make one note about getting realistic cloth. The best results I have seen are actually obtained through sculpting. A practiced hand with a tablet can get some really great results. We're not covering sculpting in this class. We don't have enough tablets for everybody, and it's its own unique skill set that is not, at least for me, it's not something that I've picked up quickly. and I'm not particularly good at it. So certainly, try it, work at it, because you can get some great results with it. But we are doing our cloth through simulations. Your mileage may vary. So it's just about done. Then we'll take a look at this, and then I'm going to add one more element to kind of break up the surface of the cloth, and that will be adding some wind. But first, let's see how this did. All right, so that's complete. I'm going to go back to frame 1, hit Alt-A. And it's still running a little slow, but it's not too bad, actually. The hood is slowly sliding off the head. I can't help it that I'm bald. It's not my choice. It does seem to affect things, though. Okay, so there's looking at this, there's a couple of things that I need to change. I need to increase the friction of the cloth so that the hood doesn't slide off my head. And I also, actually, if I increase, I was going to say I need to turn on cloth self-collision because the hood is kind of getting wrapped up in itself. But if I turn on friction and the hood doesn't slide down, then that won't really be a factor. The other thing that I want to add is wind. So let's do both those things. The first thing, I will free all the bakes, and I'm going to turn the friction up to, I don't know, 30. All right, and then before we simulate again, let's add some wind. So I'm going to Shift-C, center my 3D cursor, Shift-A, add force field and wind. By default, this is what wind looks like. Now, wind is like a sun lamp in that it doesn't have a location. It has a direction. It's a vector. So it has a direction and it has an intensity. It doesn't matter where in the scene it is, wind will blow in the same direction everywhere in the scene. So right now, wind is going to be blowing straight up at all points, not just directly below this torso. But what I want to do is actually have it blowing roughly this way, and then I like to still point it roughly at the character just for my own neurotic needs. But I will point it kind of in this direction, maybe a little bit more to the side, and maybe a touch down. So rotate that around the local x-axis by double tapping X. Okay, so this is the direction of my wind. Now, through all of my testing, I had a lot of issues getting the wind to actually work. And it seems as though that the denser the mesh is, the more wind it takes to actually move it. I don't know why, but that seems to be the way that this behaves. So I'm going to select my wind, and you can see these are the values for the wind. You have a strength value, you have a flow value, and then a noise, so the wind can kind of buff it and change intensities a little bit. A seed, which is kind of a randomness value, you can just kind of change the variation. And then a few other options, but we don't really need to worry about those at all. So with this wind value, I'm going to set the strength to 5,000. And that should give us a slight breeze. And everything else is looking good, so I'm going to go ahead and bake this, and I will return when the bake is done. Alright, so the results are pretty good, actually. If I look from the front view, you can see that the wind is blowing everything to the right, and again, like I said, it is kind of a light breeze, not as tsunami-like as you might expect with a value of 5,000. Yeah. So once you play around with this and get the values where you want it, I can go to my modifier stack and click apply on the cloth. Whoa, 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 whoa. That's right, the cloth should actually be first in the stack. So I should have applied the mirror modifier. And then, let's see if I, oops. Okay. So now if I apply the, nope. Yeah, the cloth has to be first in the stack. So I bump the subsurface modifier down, which actually should speed up any simulations that I do. I have to redo the bake. And I think this is going a little bit faster now. Yeah, you should have the cloth modifier in the first position in the stack, and then subsurface below that. Once you get that, then you just click apply on the cloth modifier, and that will apply whatever frame you're on to the whole, to every frame for that object. So I'll pause the recording again and jump back when it's done. So, all right, that is feeling a bit better, and actually now that we moved the subsurface below the cloth modifier, it seems as though the wind is having a little bit of a stronger effect, which is fine. Although it might be a little bit too strong. Anyway, let's pretend that that is what we want. I would probably make more tweaks and adjustments and decrease the value of the wind and all that. But once you get it to where you want with the cloth simulation and the cloth modifier is first in the stack, you can click apply. And now, no matter what frame I go to, this is what the cloth looks like. Okay? So that is how you use a cloth simulation to get a good resting position for your cloth. Now, if I was also going to do this with pants, which is what I have set up here, you'll notice that there isn't anything for the pants to kind of fall onto, so we need to add pinning. So I've got a pinning group right here, and now if I select my pants mesh right here, and I go into, if I look at my object data, I have a pinning vertex group. And so what I did is I selected this top row. With the weight of 1, I clicked assign. And you can visualize this if you go into weight paint mode. And you can see that the top layer is red, which is, for pinning, red won't move. It's got a value of 1. And then blue has a value of 0 and will move according to the simulation. So I've got that vertex group set up. And now when I simulate, let me set my distance down to 0.001, and I need to set my wind speed to, we'll go 2,000 this time, and then let's see. I do also want to make a note that for this simulation, I'm not using the main body. I do have a separate collision object. And if you are having problems with the bottoms of the pants not having anything to collide with and just kind of hanging out there and kind of dangling, what you can do is take your collision mesh and extrude it down past where the cloth is going to be, and then extrude it again and scale it, and maybe extrude it again and scale it up one more time. Like that, just so you have that extra bit of collision to make sure that the pants don't go where you don't want them. But once you have all that set up, we can try the bake and see what happens. All right, let's see how that went. And that actually went pretty well. So then I can take this as well, and this is a little bit more subtle. I would probably do a little bit more work on the pants to begin with before I actually simulated them, but I could do then the same thing here, and whoops, oh, I didn't simulate with the cloth first, so I'd have to resim that. But anyway, you get the idea. That's how cloth sim works. It can be a little bit finicky. It can take a little bit of time because it's make an adjustment, wait for it to render, and see how that went, and then make more adjustments. But those are the general principles, and you can get some pretty cool results with it. So yeah, let's move on.